The ground took him the way the desert takes a man who walks too far from water. Quietly. Completely. And for a long moment, nobody in Bodega Gap even knew it had happened. 7 men had worked on the hole. It took them most of the night. 2 candles, 5 shovels, and a silence between them that told Tucker everything he needed to know about what would happen when the sun came up. They dug until the bleeding edge of the horizon turned gray. Then they dragged him to the edge of town where the scrub brush started and the law ended, and they threw him in. He hit the bottom hard. The soil was still loose, still holding the warmth of the day before. Above him, 7 faces looked down from the rim of the hole. Men he had counted when they walked him out of the saloon. Men he had counted again when they forced him to his knees at the edge of the dig. 7 faces. Not one of them was the man who had paid for this. Tucker said nothing. There was nothing to say. The men who bury a man alive do not want conversation. They want compliance, and then they want the hole filled, and then they want to drink and sleep and pretend the morning did not come with a body under it. The first shovel of dirt hit his chest like a closed fist. The second hit his shoulder and slid. The third hit his face and stayed. He closed his eyes. They covered him the way they had dug the hole, in silence. 7 men in a darkness that grew heavier with every shovel. When the scraping stopped and the 7 men walked back toward town without a word between them, he was still breathing. Not for long, but still. 6 inches of earth above his face. His hands were tied behind his back. Coarse rope, double loop at the wrists. And his holster was gone and his knife was gone. And there was nothing between his body and the soil except the memory of what his lungs had held before they started filling. He did not move. They would go to the saloon, they would drink, and by morning Bodega Gap would be a place where a stranger had never existed. The ground knew him too. That was the part they had not counted. Bodega Gap sat in a valley where the desert floor rose just enough to catch what little rain fell, and hold it long enough for a town to grow around the crease. It was not a large town, a main street, a church with no congregation, a saloon whose door faced east so the afternoon heat would hit the back of every man who entered, a small cruelty designed to make the drinks feel necessary. The 7 men belonged to a rancher named Hollis Deer. Deer had 40,000 acres, 8 gunmen on his payroll, and a sheriff whose badge had been purchased the same way Deer had purchased his land, with the understanding that the land was never really his, only held in trust for whoever showed up with enough men and enough willingness to use them. Deer ran his operation the way men like Deer run operations, with the assumption that the world had rules, and the rules could be bought, and anything that resisted could be buried. Tucker had come to Bodega Gap 3 days before they buried him. He had come the way he always came, from the south, in the last hour before dusk, when the light was low and the shadows were long enough to swallow a man before the town noticed him arriving. He had stopped at the edge of the scrub brush and looked at the main street for 20 minutes. Scout stood motionless beside him, and the town did not know they were being watched. What Tucker saw, Deer's men moving through the street like they owned it. A woman carrying a child crossing the street to avoid eye contact with a rider. A sheriff leaning against a post outside the saloon, watching the dust, watching anything except what was happening in front of him. The town had given up. Tucker had seen it before, that stillness of a place where the air has learned to expect violence and has adjusted. The people moved slower. They had trained themselves to be invisible the way prey animals train themselves, and like all prey, they had forgotten that invisibility was a choice. He rode in. He tied Scout outside the saloon. He walked inside and stood at the bar and ordered a whiskey and drank it and set the glass down and looked at the bartender and asked a question. The question was about the rancher, not the name. He already knew the name. The question was about what the rancher had done in the last month, who he had taken, what he had promised and not delivered. Tucker did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The bartender looked at him for a long time, calculating how much truth he could afford to tell and to whom and when. What the bartender told him was not a lot, but it was enough. A family on the east side of town. A father who had refused to sell his land. 20 acres, enough to feed a family and no more, but he had planted it and worked it, and it was his, and Deer wanted it for the water rights. The father had been taken. The mother had been told that if she went to the sheriff, she would be taken too. The children had not been touched, but they had been made to watch. Deer's men had lined them up on the porch and shown them what happened to people who resisted. And the father was still alive, still in Deer's barn, and the mother had not slept since. The bartender told Tucker this with his voice low and his eyes on the glass he was wiping. He did not look at Tucker when he finished. Tucker finished his whiskey. He set the glass down. He walked to the door and stopped and stood there for a moment with his back to the room, and in that moment the bartender heard something in the silence. It was not a sound. It was the absence of a sound, the sound of a man deciding something, and the decision being so final that the air around it went still. Tucker left. The next 3 days were the quietest of Deer's life. He did not know that Tucker was still in town, that Tucker had moved to the edge of the property, to a ridge above the barn where the mesquite grew thick and a man could watch without being seen. He did not know that Tucker was counting his men, noting the patterns, watching the way they moved between the house and the barn and the line shacks in the northeast corner where the water ran clean, and Deer kept the horses he did not want anyone to know he had. 7 men. Deer had 7 gunmen on the payroll, but only 5 were in Bodega Gap on any given day. The other 2 were in a town 30 miles north, collecting a debt. 5 men. Tucker counted them on the first day. He counted them again on the second day. Same time, same positions, and the sameness told him what he needed to know. These were men who had settled into a routine, and routines in men who carry guns are the first sign that they have stopped expecting trouble. On the third day, Tucker went to the barn. He went at night. He went alone. Scout was tied in the mesquite, still, waiting, the way Scout always waited when Tucker had work to do that the horse could not help with. The barn was lit from the inside by a lantern, and the light came through the cracks in long, orange lines. Tucker moved along the outside of the barn until he found the door, and he put his hand on it and stood there and listened. Voices inside. 2 men. A man who was asking a question, and a man who was answering with a violence that the answer was designed to produce. Tucker knew the sound. He had heard it before, in other barns, in other towns, in the architecture of cruelty that men build when they have power and no one to check them. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The father was tied to a post. His face was swollen and his shirt was torn, and there was a cut above his eye that had bled into his hair and dried there, dark and stiff. 2 men stood over him. One had a rope. The other had nothing in his hands, which meant he was the one who did the talking, and the talking was always worse than the hitting. They saw Tucker. They did not draw, not immediately. They looked at him first, the way men look at something that does not fit the shape of what they expected. He was not supposed to be there. The word had gone out that a stranger was in town, and the stranger had been handled, and they had handled him. And the stranger was in a hole outside of town with dirt over his face. And therefore the man standing in the doorway of this barn could not be that stranger. And so they looked at him and calculated, and the calculation took about 2 seconds. During those 2 seconds, Tucker closed the distance. He did not draw his gun. There was no need. The first man was close enough to reach, and reaching was faster than drawing, and the fist was faster than the word. The second man reached for his gun, and Tucker hit him in the throat, and the gun stayed in the holster, and the man stood there with his hand on the leather and his mouth open and no air coming in or going out, and Tucker hit him once more, and he went down and stayed. The father looked up. He looked at Tucker, and the look was not gratitude, and it was not surprise. It was the look of a man who had stopped expecting help so long ago that when it arrived, he had forgotten how to recognize it. Tucker cut the ropes. He handed the man a knife. His own knife, the one strapped to his leg that they had not found. He handed him the rope from the post and said one word, horses. The man went. Tucker stayed. He listened to the sounds of the barn, the breathing of 2 men on the ground, one conscious and one not, and the distant sound of the town going about its business, unaware of what was happening at the edge of Deer's property. He found what he was looking for. Deer was in the house. The lights were on. Tucker moved through the dark until he was 30 yards from the front door and stood in the shadow of a cottonwood. Through the windows, he could see Deer was not alone. Someone was pacing, the pacing of a man waiting for bad news. The bad news arrived the way bad news always arrives. Not all at once, but in pieces that only made sense when you stepped back far enough to see the whole picture. First, the sound of horses, 2 of them, moving fast, east. Then the sound of shouting from the barn. Then the front door of the house opening and Deer standing on the porch with a gun in his hand, and his face doing something it had never done before, which was showing the fear that he had spent 40 years learning to hide. He saw Tucker at the edge of the light. The moment between them lasted 3 seconds. Deer raised the gun. Tucker did not move. Deer's hand was shaking. Not much, not enough for most people to notice, but Tucker noticed, and the noticing was enough. Deer fired. The shot went wide. Tucker moved. He reached Deer before the second shot, and the second shot never came. Deer hit the porch on his back, and the gun went flying, and Tucker stood over him. And Deer looked up, and Deer saw something in Tucker's face that Deer had never seen in any man's face before, which was the absolute absence of hesitation. Tucker told Deer what he knew. Everything Deer had done in the last 6 months, including the things Deer had done in the dark and never told anyone, including the things that Deer had told himself were necessary and private and no one's business. Deer listened. When Tucker finished, Deer understood that there was no negotiation, no deal, No price that could be paid that would undo what had been done. Tucker was not the law. He was not the government. He was a man, standing in the dark, telling another man what he knew, and what he knew was enough. Deer reached for a second gun. He did not make it. What happened to Deer is not the story. The story is what came after. Because Deer had 7 men, and after the barn and after the house, there were still 5 men unaccounted for. 5 men who had been in the saloon when the trouble started. 5 men who heard the shots and the horses and came running and arrived at the house to find Deer on the porch and Tucker standing over him and the night not yet finished. They did not rush. 5 men against 1 man in the open is not a fight. It is a formality. They walked toward the house with their guns drawn and their confidence high, and they stopped when they saw what was on the porch. Deer was alive, but he was not the kind of alive that matters. He was breathing and he was seeing and he was aware, and those 3 things were all he had. The 5 men talked. Tucker listened. He stood on the porch with Deer at his feet, and he listened to 5 men discuss what to do with him, and the discussion was the discussion of men who were not used to being afraid and did not recognize the feeling when it arrived. They argued about whether to kill him now or take him somewhere else. They argued about who would do it. And in the arguing, they revealed the thing that Tucker had already counted. These were men who worked for a man, and the man was on the porch, not speaking. And when the man who pays you stops speaking, the men who are paid start calculating. They decided to bury him. They took him to the edge of town where the scrub brush started and the law ended. They dug the hole with shovels from the general store. The store owner opened for them without a word because he had learned not to ask questions. They put him in the hole and tied his hands behind his back and took his gun and his knife and stood at the edge and looked down at him. One of them spoke. He said, "You should have stayed out of this town." Tucker looked up at him. He said, "You should have counted." They filled the hole. 6 inches of earth. His hands were tied. His lungs were working, but each breath brought soil. Fine, dry, the dust of a desert that had never learned to hold water. He breathed in and the earth entered him. He breathed out and the earth stayed. He did not move. His fingers worked the rope. Not fast. Fast would waste air, and the air was the only thing he had. The rope was coarse, double loop at the wrists. Tucker had been tied before, and the knowledge was in the patience. The body has to stay still so the fingers can work. He worked the double loop. Each breath was a choice between oxygen and soil, and he chose oxygen first. The loop came free on the left wrist, then the right. He sat up. The soil above him was loose. They had filled it fast, not packed it, and loose soil has space between the grains. He pushed. The weight was roughly 200 pounds of earth, but it was the weight of a grave, and graves are made to be opened. He pushed, and the soil moved, and the dark above him changed by a shade. Not light, but a different kind of dark. The dark of the sky seen through dirt. And he kept pushing, and the 6 inches became 12, and the 12 became a gap, and he reached up, and his hand found air. He pulled himself out of the ground the way the desert pulls itself back after a fire, slowly, with everything that was supposed to be dead still somehow alive underneath. He lay on the surface, and the stars were out, and they did not care that he was alive or dead. He stood in the dark at the edge of Bodega Gap, with soil in his hair and his lungs, and he stood there long enough for the cold to come in, and the heat of the day to finish leaving, and he looked at the town, and the town did not know he was standing there. The 5 men who had buried him were back in the saloon. They were drinking. They had walked away and they were drinking, and the drinking was proof that the walking away had worked. The first man died at his chair. He did not see it coming. The light went out of his eyes the way a candle goes out when you pinch the wick. Not blown, not extinguished, just ended. And his glass hit the table, and the whiskey stayed in the glass, and no one moved until the man next to him reached for his shoulder and found that it was cold. The second man died outside the saloon. He had stepped out to relieve himself and to breathe air that did not have the smell of 5 men and their decisions in it. He was standing against the wall when the dark moved, and the dark had a hand, and the hand was precise. He leaned against the wall and slid down it, and the wall held him for a moment before it let him go, and he sat on the ground, and his eyes were open, and the stars were above him, and they did not care. The third man was in the street. He had heard something, a displacement, the particular silence that happens when a man who should be making noise is no longer making noise. He stepped out of the saloon and into the street, and the street was empty, and the emptiness was not empty. The emptiness was a shape, and the shape was watching him, and the watching was the last thing he understood before the understanding ended. The fourth man ran. He was the smart one, or the scared one, which in these situations is the same thing. He ran toward the south, toward the desert, toward the place where the scrub brush started and the law ended. and he made it 30 yards before the ground decided to stop him. He fell from a root, from a hole in the dark that his foot found, and his ankle did not survive. The dark came down around him, and he understood that the dark was not the dark. The dark was a man, and the man was standing above him, and the reason that mattered was not mercy, but the simple arithmetic of what had been done and what was owed. The fifth man was the one who had spoken in the hole. "You should have stayed out of this town." He had said that, and the saying was the thing that mattered, because it told Tucker something about the man, that he was the kind who spoke before killing, the kind who needed to hear himself say it, the kind who thought that the words were the violence, and the violence was just the part that came after. He was in the saloon still, behind the bar, pouring himself a drink because the saloon had emptied, and the bartender had gone, and the bottles were still there, and the bottle he was pouring from was Deer's best, and Deer was not using it anymore. Tucker walked in. The man looked up. He saw the soil in the hair and the dirt on the clothes and the face that belonged to the man who should have been dead and buried at the edge of town, where the scrub brush started, and the man's hand moved toward his gun, and the movement was slow, too slow. The movement of a man who had buried someone and was now looking at someone who had been buried, and the looking was the last thing he did. After, Tucker walked to the edge of town where the hole was. The hole was still there, a dark place in the ground where the soil was different, darker, looser. He stood at the edge of it. He did not look down. He did not need to. It was where they had put him, and he had come back. And the coming back was the only sermon that needed preaching. He mounted Scout. The horse stood in the mesquite and waited, and did not startle when Tucker put his hand on the saddle. Scout knew the feel of Tucker's hand and the weight of Tucker's body, and the particular silence that meant it was time to go. Tucker rode north. He did not look back. The town behind him was lit by a single lamp in the saloon window, and the lamp was the only light in Bodega Gap, a town that had forgotten how to ask for help, and the help had come anyway, and the help had cost what it always cost. Everything the men who thought they were in charge had been willing to spend to keep the world the way they wanted it. The desert night cooled his face. The stars turned overhead. Scout moved through the dark at a pace that would hold for hours, and the miles behind him were not the miles of a man who had won. They were the miles of a man who had completed what he came to do, and the completion was its own country, and he rode through it without joy and without sorrow, the way weather moves through a place after it has done what it came to do. If you found yourself in that hole, dirt in your lungs, hands tied behind your back, the dark pressing down, what would you have done? Comment below. And if you want stories like this one, subscribe. The desert has more of them, and the Nameless Gunslinger is not finished.